there is hope for a better world. Because it is kind of tough when you look outside, look at the world around us and see what's going on. How could you say that we're headed in the right direction? How could you come away with the conclusion that we are headed towards a better world? You could be forgiven for looking at the news or reading a news website or anything like that and come away with a pessimistic attitude about the world's choices or chances, And we wouldn't be alone. Every twice a year, the Harvard Kennedy Institute of Politics does a survey of 18 to 29-year-olds on various topics and various issues from time to time. This past spring, they did one asking young people about their mental outlook for the future, gauging where they thought they were going. And it's kind of helpful if you want to gauge a future trend. Why not ask the group of people that are going to live in that future? And so they asked these 18 to 29-year-olds what they thought of their mental health and kind of, like I say, looking forward. And the results are kind of shocking, at least from my perspective. How often in the last 2 weeks did you feel down, depressed, or hopeless? And just to give it a bit of context up on here, this is a descending scale. So that was 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, or that might have been 21. It's the last 4 years. How often in the last 2 weeks have you felt depressed or hopeless? 44%. And you could say it's trending in the right direction. You can take statistics and put them however you want. That's still greater than 4.5 people out of 10 felt depressed or hopeless in the last 2 weeks. Lonely. How often did you feel lonely in the last 2 weeks? Again, 4 in 10 people said they felt lonely in a generation that's growing up knowing nothing but the internet and connectivity and social media and all these things that are supposed to make us more connected than ever before. 4 in 10 people say they're lonely. They've maybe the loneliest generation to ever be, and yet claim to be the most connected. How often have you felt like a sense of impending doom? Every 2 weeks, you're feeling like something bad is going to happen. 38%, again, 4 in 10 people felt impending doom. And this one is as scary as well. Thoughts that you might be better off dead or thoughts of hurting yourself in some way. 1 in 5 had that feeling. And that doesn't give us a great outlook for the world. The generation that has the most to live, the most ahead of them, everything going for them, and they don't have that bright outlook on where it's going. A significant portion of that group feels hopeless, feels like things are out of their control. And they look at the world and say that there's nothing for me here. There's nothing that it has to offer. And it isn't super hard to see or to feel that way when you read the news or when you look. We're going to just take a glance back the last 25 years from kind of my memorable lifetime. What's gone on in the last 25 years as far as issues that might make you feel hopeless. 16 years ago right now, we were in the middle of what was called the Great Recession. Ben Bernanke, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve at that time, said it was the worst financial crisis in global history, including the events of the Great Depression. You remember again from your news, banks were failing, businesses were being bailed out by the government. It was a significant economic downturn. A lot of people were concerned about what was going on in the financial markets. And we turned a corner, and through the 2010s, it felt like, things might be going the right way. But then 2020 hit, and government spending goes through the roof. Draw your attention, the Canadian debt isn't quite as impressive as the US one. But if you can make out what that chart says on the far side, the green lines going up and down are every time that they had to raise the debt ceiling in the US. And I'd like to draw your attention to once in 1997 it was raised. The chart, that's not a mistake. That's how often the debt ceiling has been raised in the last 10 years in the US. And in particular, in the last 3 years, spending from 2020 to 2024 has gone up $15 trillion. You may as well say $1 squillion. Like it doesn't, at that point, it doesn't even matter. Just to put it into perspective, if this little black square is $1 billion, then that's 1,000 black squares. That's $1 trillion. And then take and multiply that by 36 is how many trillions of dollars the US is in debt. It's not getting paid off. And so what? The government's always been in debt. Well, this starts to affect us, and it starts to especially affect a future generation. This is a little older chart, but it talks about housing prices. And for a good portion of time, house prices were relative to the money you had in your pocket. After you paid your bills, you always had a little bit of change jingling there, and that's kind of what that was reflective of. You didn't feel like you were under the gun. If you wanted a treat or something, you could afford it. Well, in the last decade especially, that number has shot through the roof. And what do you do if you're a young person that wants to get a house? Well, I have to choose between groceries or living at home with mom and dad. I got to live at home. Those are the choices that you're faced with. And again, where it starts to affect us, cost of things in the last, again, this is since 2000. If you can read it at the top, broadly speaking, price levels have increased 74% since the year 2000, and especially hospital, college, and tuition, which young people would never need any of those things. Those have gone through the roof in the meantime. Housing and food beverages, same thing. That's kind of the baseline when it says 74%, just because those things are so dramatic at the top. That's 74%, which is food, beverage, and housing, is right around the 74% mark in 24 years. That's kind of depressing to look at. And so it's not a great picture financially when we outlook from there, especially for a young person starting out. There's several other issues as well that the world faces. There's environmental issues. The state of the environment is a top concern for many people. Carbon emissions, pollution control, all sorts of things are a major focus. In another 25 years, it's expected that the Earth's population is going to go to 10 billion people. How is the Earth going to hold up under that many people? And we would say, well, the things are being done towards it. Different countries have cut carbon emissions, like North America. You can see this is information that's available. Our carbon emissions have gone down. But as you can see, China doesn't really care, nor India or any of these other developing countries. And we can't really blame them because they can't afford to do it. They're trying to lift their countries out of poverty, but that means that carbon emissions go through the roof. And so what do? Do we tell them that they have to leave their people in abject poverty, or do we sacrifice the environment in the meantime? It's a tough picture to look at. And we could say, well, North America is doing all right. How have they done it? We could say things like electric cars. Well, that's a two-edged sword as well. We don't often see in the Tesla commercials the guy driving by the lithium tailing pools where they were refining the lithium for it. Or they don't show a Tesla driver showing up to the child labor mines where they're pulling the cobalt out with their bare hands. There's questions on both sides of this, and there's no obvious answer for us, and it's kind of a bleak picture to look at when we think of the environment. There's no easy answer for that. How do we get to a solution for that? Sickness and disease is another one that can weigh on us. The past 100 years have made significant strides in the healthcare field. That is a list of diseases, diphtheria, measles, mumps, whooping cough, polio, basically eradicated from the earth in the last 100 years through medical advancement. Infectious disease as a cause of death has all but been eliminated. And this next pie chart shows that. If you went back to 1910, you stood a 50% chance of dying of an infectious disease. And by note, diabetes and Alzheimer's were not a cause of death 125 years ago. Fast forward to 2010, where this chart is, infectious disease death is down to 3%, which is remarkable. But now we live old enough to get cancer, diabetes, and Alzheimer's. And so did we solve the problem? Well, yeah, we beat those diseases. It's great that we're not losing young people and all that. But we haven't solved death and disease. And furthermore, as a young person, if you're concerned, 44%, again, 4 in 10 people, adults over 20, have at least one chronic condition. A chronic condition used to be something that when you got to be 65, that's what you lived with. Well, now that's the plight of the younger generation as well. And so, yes, we've progressed. It feels like a game of whack-a-mole. You beat one down and another one pops up, or you live long enough to suffer from something else. We haven't solved health and illness. But what about world peace? Several of us in here are old enough to remember this. Next week will mark the 35th anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down. It was a symbolic end to the Cold War, and basically that finally shut the door on what went on in World War II. That was the end of the Cold War. Russia and the US agreed to kind of a stalemate, as it were, and probably the closest as we've ever gotten to world peace. Currently in the world, there are there's 25 wars or major wars going on. There's an additional 20 armed conflicts, and the way this chart from Wikipedia categorizes a war is the amount of casualties in the past year there. 25 major wars or wars going on, additional 20 armed conflicts. And we don't realize necessarily how fortunate we are to live in when we see that map of the world colored up, how fortunate we are to live in a peaceful part of this world. But for many people, that's not the reality. And notably in the news right now, there's what's going on in Gaza, with Israel fighting a war against Hamas in the south, Hezbollah in the north, and just in the last few days, Iran has been an issue as well. And as well, there's conflict in Russia and Ukraine. And both these conflicts have potential to broaden out into a broader global war. And so if you were to look forward or to forecast, are the next 6 months more likely to solve this, or are they likely to get worse before they get better? It's tough to have a hopeful outlook on that. And these are just a handful of issues. I'm sure we'd come up with 4 more or another dozen. Some of us can remember a time when none of these things seemed to be very much on the plate. It seems like I say, at the end of the Cold War, world peace was well on its way. There's a few things that didn't seem to be, government debt was only in the mere trillions. There was a few things like that. And yet our children are growing up in a world where they know nothing else but these issues in the last 25 years. And so why does this, again, leave us feeling hopeless? Well, who is most likely to solve this is likely a government, but at the same time that we've been facing these issues, and maybe as a result, I'll just bring you to the circle in the center. This is trust in public institutions, nonprofits, news media, government, small, medium, and large corporations. Governments who are the most likely to answer these questions or to turn to, 1/3 of people no longer trust that the government has the ability to solve any of the issues that they're dealing with. And so they're not really easy issues to deal with. Where does that leave us? Why haven't we been able to achieve utopia? Why haven't we been able to find a solution to these things? Why do they always elude us? And the first thing I would say is these issues are really bigger than a dollar amount. There's no dollar amount that you can throw at what's going on in Gaza or Lebanon right now that's going to bring that to a close. You can't throw a dollar amount at what's going on in Russia. Russia's been sanctioned beyond anything, and yet it's still going on. And if you listen to the interview with Vladimir Putin, he has 1,000 years of Russian history that are guiding him. That's not a dollar amount, that's a mindset. The issues are bigger than political will. In our lifetime, we've seen dozens of politicians, and yet the problems are still there. They're not going away in any of those things. And I'm sure just because we went through 3 or 4, I could highlight another 6 or 8 that might be on the top of your mind. And just because I might romanticize the mid to late 90s as the peak of human civilization where we had minimal problems, I'm sure if you went back there and gave the same talk, that there were issues that we were facing. I'm sure if you went back to other times in history, there were always issues, because I believe that these issues have always been there in one form or another. The way we look at them may have changed. The root of this world's hopelessness is a feeling like nothing is going to change, because nothing has for several years. We've seen failed attempts at peace, failed environmental movements, failed financial policy. And to feel hopeful, you have to believe something's going to change, or that change at least is possible. And when you've seen history or years and years of failed policy, it's hard to remain with a positive outlook. So what I'd like to take a few minutes to do is and explain the scriptural case as to why we feel that something is going to change in the future. But the best place to start is how we actually got to where we are in the first place. Why is the world like this? What does the Bible say? The best place to start for that is in the beginning. The book of Genesis outlines that we live in a world that is unsettled, tumultuous, and unfortunately that problem is baked into the cake in the world that we live in. Sin is the primary source of many of the issues we face. When Adam first introduced sin into the world, God had to decide how to deal with it. He could strike Adam down on the spot, but this would be unmerciful. He could just ignore what Adam had done and say, oh, well, things happen, but that would make doing the right thing pointless. Or he could do the third thing, which did happen in the earth. He could place Adam, and by extension the rest of humanity, in a world that was under a probationary time. We'd experience all of God's goodness. We could understand his plan and purpose, but we would do so in a world that would be challenging, a world in which we would ultimately die, and where day-to-day experience could be met with difficulty and a sense of futility. And this is the world in which we live. And so how did that come to pass? Well, as a consequence of sin, it says in Genesis 3 that the earth was cursed. So there was a change in the earth after sin. It would be in sorrow that he would eat in it all the days of his life. So previous to that, the earth was bountiful and blessed. As a result of sin, it was going to be cursed. The earth was going to fight against Adam and against mankind. Thorns and thistles it would bring forth. So while he was working it, the earth would be fighting against him. It would be a sense of futility in what he was doing. But this is also the sense or other things that we get in that there would be natural forces that would go against that. Drought, tornadoes, wildfire, earthquake, all those sort of things would fight against mankind as a result of sin. Another verse speaking of this in Romans 8, this is from the English Standard Version. It says, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from this bondage." So God put this in order as a result of sin, so that we would get a sense of futility in what was happening in the earth, not in God's purpose, but in the sense of the world itself. There was going to be a sense in which it felt difficult, in which it felt hopeless in the things that we were doing. So on top of that, the earth would kind of fight against mankind. We were also cursed with mortality as a result of that. And again, just in that same passage back in Genesis, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread till thou return to the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." And so again, as a result of sin, human beings became mortal. We have sickness, we have disease, we have aches and pains, and ultimately we die. And realistically, we can't do anything about that either. We're mortal, and as a result, that's what our lot is. We conquer some of those through medicine, and we find new ones that need to be conquered for everything that goes through it. And so mortality is a battle against our health. It's a battle against our bodies. And we're given these mortal bodies by God to live in that experience problems. They're definitely not perfect. And we need to stop and consider why that is. Along with that, there was a desire to sin that came upon the creation. Before, it was described as very good. After sin, it's described as every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6 says, and Christ says in the gospel, "For within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornication, murders, and so on. All these evil things come from within and defile the man." Without God in our life, our nature pulls us in this direction. Without the influence of God's word, this is the direction we tend in. And so a part of the reason is that we live in an earth that is fighting against us, and we live in bodies that are fighting against us. Well, then we have a nature that fights against us as well. Rather than just being easy to do the right thing, we have to fight to do the right thing. And God has given us free will and the potential to use it. Unfortunately, many in this world give in to that full list of things and create a whole host of other problems for the earth when they go to that extent. Think of how many conflicts and wars could be resolved if there was no pride, if there was no deceit, if there was no hatred, no greed. Imagine a financial world with no greed. A world where everyone was selfless would be an incredible world, but that's not the world we live in. And so as a consequence of Adam's sin entering the world, that is the world we live in. We have the ability to fix some things, but another pops up. It's a sense, like Romans said, it's a sense of futility. because for every step forward you make, you take a step back, or you take a step sideways, or take two back. It goes on and on. So why would God do that to us? It does give us a moment to stop and reflect. We're going to take a few verses from the book of Ecclesiastes. And if you've ever read the book of Ecclesiastes, in a nutshell, it's a record of Solomon's social experiment where he gives himself everything he could ever want in this life, everything he could ever enjoy. He had all the money and all the resources to do it. And despite everything, having everything at his hand, despite being the king and doing anything he wanted, he came to this same conclusion that life is futile in those things, despite having all the money to solve all his problems. These are some of the conclusions that he comes to. What profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboureth? It's a fool's errand. I've seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised thereby. It's a work to live, and God has placed us in that. But he also comes to this conclusion in the verse 11. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also he has set the world in men's hearts, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. And as crummy a picture as I painted of the world at the start, it's not all bad. We can definitely see beauty every fall when we see the color in the leaves change. You can't help but feel inspired. It's not all bad, especially if we unplug from the news. 50% of the world's problems go away right there. Not everything that we have in the world is bad. There is incredible joy in family and in friendship. We saw the glories of the northern lights here. We see the miracle of winter dormancy, the beauty of spring resurrection. God hath made all these beautiful things for us to enjoy. And it says there, he set the world in our heart. There's a sense that we can get when we look at those things, that there's got to be something more to it than just the leaves changed, or the snow came and that tree looked dead, but in the spring I know it's coming back. You can take that attitude, but it's not really the attitude that it was designed to have. Solomon goes on in that, and he comes to another list of conclusions. Again, he's looked at how futile life is, and when he's had every resource at his disposal to solve them, he comes to this conclusion in Ecclesiastes 7. He says, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men. The house of mourning is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. Solomon says it's better to be sad or to support those who are mourning, those who are sad, who are going through a rough time, rather than to live like a glutton. Because you won't always live like as if it's Thanksgiving Day, stuffing your belly with turkey, but in the end, you'll end up mourning. You will experience sadness in your life. You'll experience a sense of hopelessness at some point. And those who are still alive to appreciate it, those who haven't died, the living will lay it to his heart. They'll stop and think about why the world is this way. Solomon says, if you're smart, you'll keep it. You'll keep it in your heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, he says again. Not that we should go around bawling our eyes out, but it's very seldom that you see someone who is sorrowing who isn't sober, who isn't taking life seriously for the first time maybe in a while. And so Solomon is telling us that it doesn't do us bad to be sorrowful from time to time, because we'll actually stop and consider what is going on. By the sadness of the countenance, the heart is made better. It actually will put you in a better place before God. And so along with that, when we feel hopeless or we feel lonely or when we feel any one of those things, part of that is an opportunity to reflect and to consider what's going on in the world. Again, he goes on in that same passage there in Ecclesiastes, says the heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning. Again, that's his counsel, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. And again, you've never gone to a place where people are partying and seen any serious, deep, and meaningful conversation. It just doesn't lend itself to it. There are a lot of deep and meaningful conversations that happen beside hospital beds or in old age homes. It's far more a place where you consider the serious things of life. And Solomon says that those days of adversity, as he says there, in the day of prosperity, be joyful. There's nothing wrong with enjoying a party or a good time or friends and family. He says, but in the day of adversity, consider God has set one over against the other to the end that man should not find nothing out after him. So there's going to be days that are good, but there's also going to be adversity. And God wants us to stop when there's adversity and to consider what the end goal of life is. Do you have the plan, or does God have the plan with the earth? Moving out of Ecclesiastes, another book, a few verses from the book of Job. And again, if you've never read the story of Job is very relevant to what we're considering here. In a very short amount of time, Job lost absolutely everything in his life. If you wanted to look at the life of somebody who was hopeless, Job certainly would fit the bill. He lost all his material wealth through theft and violence. All his flocks and his herds were stolen from him. In an instant, he lost servants. He was reduced to nothing. At the same time, he loses his children. He loses all hope for his future descendants. And then he loses his good health on top of all that. And he begins to waste away with disease. He loses any respect or prestige that he had before. And he begins to feel abandoned. He begins to feel left alone. It reads a very sobering picture of Job's mental state after all that he went through. Just about everything that could go wrong in your life went wrong in the book of Job. And there was no obvious sign of things ever improving for him. Again, if you wanted to take somebody who was hopeless, here it was. And so the central portion of the book of Job, there's 42 chapters, the central portion of it basically centers on an argument trying to get at why Job was suffering so badly. And Job's friends show up and they accuse him of being a great sinner. And they say, well, because you've sinned, Job, then it must be the reason that you're suffering so great. And Job protests, well, I haven't sinned at all, and that only makes the matters worse. And so the book basically goes back and forth till it comes to a stalemate, and a fourth friend intervenes named Elihu, who introduces a different perspective on the issue of why Job is going through those things. Job, he suggests, is living in this world of uncertainty that I've built the case for. We live in a world where we don't know what God has set the beginning against the end. We don't know when we're going to have a day of prosperity. We don't know when we're going to have a day of adversity. You live in this world. It's not a question of how badly you've sinned or anything like that, but it's a question of you stop to consider whose solution are you looking for in this. And just a few things, again, to highlight the issues that we might have looked at there before. Elihu says, individuals are chastened also with pain upon a bed, and the multitude of his bones is strong pain. His life abhorreth bread, and his soul dainty meat. In illness, his flesh is consumed away that it cannot be seen. His bones stick out. He says, well, why does God do these things? He worketh oftentimes with man to bring his soul back from the pit, to be enlightened with the light of the living. He wants us in those instances to stop and consider the direction that our life is going. Do we think that we are going to solve that? Do you think if we get raised up off a bed of sickness, that somehow we're going to live forever and ever and ever? Or do we need God in our life? And Elihu's point is that there are times when it's smooth sailing. We never stop to consider when we feel good, but we have several moments when we're not feeling good, when we're sick. It's an excellent time to stop and consider where we're going in life. What about violence and conflict? Again, this is from the ESV. He says, behold, the multitude of oppressions, because of the multitude of oppressions, people cry out. They cry out for help because of the arm of the mighty, and violence, conflict, all those things. But in that, they cry out, but none says, where is God, my maker, who gives me songs in the night, who teaches me more than the beasts of the earth and makes us wiser than the birds of the heavens. And so Elihu's conclusion is, when you're seeing those things, who are you crying out for? Nobody is crying out to God and asking him for his solution in that. They think that they've got the arm or the solution itself. God intends that in that situation, we turn to him. In natural disasters or weather phenomenon, the context of this shows that it's speaking about the weather in this case. It says it is turned around by his counsel that they may do whatsoever he commandeth them on the face of the whole world. God causes the weather to come, whether for correction or for his land or for mercy. Hear this, O Job, stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. And every year in the news, we see these demonstrations of what the weather can do. And the lesson from Elihu to Job is God has a purpose in that. When we see a hurricane come through and just rip a house up by the foundation, and you sit there and that is power that you can't comprehend. What do you do in the face of that? Do you dig deeper foundations? Is that the solution there? Or do we live in a world that we can't ultimately control? We live in a world, are we going to shake our fist at God for sending the hurricane, or are we going to humble ourselves before him? And two other instances on that, just as far as our perspective on this world. Christ, speaking about tragedy, there's two instances in Luke 13. The first is a tragedy. It's a massacre of these Galileans that Pilate had taken and killed and mixed the blood with their sacrifices. Jesus answers, saying unto them, suppose these Galileans were sinners above all the Galileans because they suffered such things. Do you think these Galileans deserved it? What does Christ say that we should do? Should arrest Pilate? Should we have an inquiry? Should we protest in the streets? Any of these things? His message is simple. I tell you, except you repent, ye shall in likewise perish. We are always going to live in a world that's out of our control. There will always be people who choose violence. There will always be people who choose to do evil things. What is it that we can control? We can control our choice, where our mind goes. Do we go to, I have a solution, or does God have a solution? And again, on tragedy, here's a terrible accident. 18 people who died when the Tower of Siloam fell. Christ's response, fire the builder, the architect, the engineer, hire a new inspector, no, repent. We live in a world where there are problems that don't make any sense. We live in a world that does feel hopeless from time to time. Maybe we should start to look in a different direction. Maybe we should start to think that I don't have the answer and that maybe God has the answer. And while we live in a world that seems futile, that seems hopeless at some point, what is it that the Bible tells us that we have to look forward to? Or what a better place to start than to unwind everything that was done back as a consequence of sin. When Christ returns, it will start with a change of nature. 1 Corinthians 15 tells us that in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye at the last trump, for the trumpet will sound and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. We made the case that many of the evils that we see in the world are a consequence of sin. And the world we live in is a product of many of those consequences coming to pass. We believe Christ is going to return and start to reverse the process that started with sin entering the world. If we obey him through baptism, through our character, through the way we live, then we can start to put ourselves in a position to be ready for that day. We look forward to a change in nature rather than struggling to do the right thing. Have it come natural to us. The sin-prone nature that we have within us will be given a nature that's not capable of sinning. Will be switched from mortality to immortality. Just as a little aside, we can choose to start doing that right now in our own life. We can start to choose to do the right thing, to do what God asks of us. We can adopt God's attitude towards sin. We can do all these things to live selfless lives, to show God's love to others. Those are things we can do right now that show that this is actually where we want to be in our life. We should try in our life showing that we want something greater. Along with mortality to immortality, that's going to repeal many of the health issues that we face. It'll change the way we feel. We'll be rejuvenated, strengthened. The weak hands and the feeble knees will be strengthened. The attitude of fearfulness will be gone. That feeling of anxiety, of not knowing what's coming next on the earth, will be done away with. It says the eyes of the blind will be opened and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. A physical rejuvenation. Many of the health issues that we face right now will be done away with. Again, the lame shall leap as the hart, and the tongue of the deaf shall sing. And again, not just a physical regeneration, but that last verse speaks about the mental outlook of the people that will take part in this. They will come to Zion with songs of everlasting joy upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, sorrow and sighing shall flee away. As you start to see the world reverse those impacts of sin, all of a sudden, as solutions start to be meaningful in that, there will be a sense of hope brought upon this earth. Sorrow and sighing will be done away with, but joy and gladness, something looking forward to something more permanent in this earth. This will also necessitate a change in leadership, and regardless of the politician, it's likely to be more of the same. With some progress, some regression, Christ's return is going to usher in a change of leadership. He's going to bring about a new political order on the earth as well. He's going to be a king unlike anything we've ever seen. It says that the Spirit of God will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And you could probably say that a wise and intelligent ruler, if nothing else, would be refreshing, but ruling with a perfect knowledge, knowing what to do at the right time, would make him unlike any other. It says there that he's going to not judge after the sight of his eyes, nor reprove after the hearing of the ears, but with righteousness he's going to judge the poor and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And so again, there's not going to be any swayed by outward appearances. He isn't going to be fooled by what he sees or somebody talking in his ear. Political lobbying, interest groups, bribes, scandals, all those things are going to be done away with because of having a leader that is not swayed by such things. He's going to be firm and unyielding in upholding what is right. And so justice will be there in the right order, balanced with mercy. He is not going to overlook people because they're poor or treat people special because they're rich. Right and wrong will be objective under the rulership of Christ. And again, this will solve many of the things that the world is faced with as well. A change in the natural world will also accompany this. Again, the environmental issues that plague the earth will be done away with. The wilderness and the solitary place will be glad for them. The desert will blossom as the rose. It'll blossom abundantly. There'll be a physical rejuvenation of the earth as well. And I'm not sure if you can read that last part. The parched ground will become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water. Everything is going to be fruitful and bountiful. Another reference I don't have on the screen, but Psalm 72 verse 16 speaks that food will be so bountiful that even in the tops of the mountains you'll be able to find corn. And so we'll look forward to a time when we won't fight against the earth, but the earth will actually bless us and produce bountifully. And as well, there'll be a change in the nations as well. Isaiah, again, speaking of the future age, it says, many people shall go and say, come ye, let us go up to the mountain of the house of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. And so the start of a change in the nations will actually be a spiritual education for them. Education in the laws of Christ, in the way he is going to govern things, and what will the impact of teaching people this. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. So the weapons of war will actually, all the energy and the effort put into war and munitions and ammunition and all that sort of stuff will be turned and put into agriculture, to producing food for people. Said, nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither will they learn war anymore. And so why do we say there is hope for a better world? We do so because God has promised so in his word that there is a change coming to this earth. That in the near future, Christ is going to return and establish a new form of government, a new kingdom that answers the problems that have plagued this earth since its inception. And this plan is laid out for us by Peter in 2 Peter 3. He says, the Lord is not slack concerning his the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And that is the period we're in right now. He's asking us to change the way we're living. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for a new heavens and a new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness.